coming up on Chopper's Politics.
I feel so passionately about the great remaining in Britain and us remaining Great Britain, and I will fight like fury to influence the government to do what I absolutely know what's right.
I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. Chopper to my friends, and this is Chopper's Politics. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, emerged this week into the daylight after 2 weeks of self-isolation in number 10 Downing Street. And he's not the only one, as millions in England found out what morsels of freedom they'd been given back by their government as the country heads out of lockdown. Yes, it's back to the tears. Remember them? But they're so tough in some places, many will wonder if they ever left lockdown in the first place. And the impact of Rishi Sunak's spending review continues to reverberate around Westminster, with the Office for Budget Responsibility's dire forecast dominating many front pages. Well, someone who can crunch those rather bleak-looking numbers for us is former Trade Secretary Liam Fox. I'll be talking to him later about why placing entrepreneurs at the heart of economic recovery is key. And from talking about entrepreneurs to talking to one. John Caldwell, the former boss of mobile phone chain Phones for You, will be here telling us about his fears for tears and whether he thinks his £500,000 donation to the Tory party a year ago was money well spent. I'd stay tuned for that one if I were you. But first, as we charge towards the end of England's lockdown next week, there are rumbles already of yet another Tory rebellion. Conservative MPs object to large swathes of the country coming out of lockdown, only to still be under strict restrictions in these new tiers. Greater Manchester, for example, has been under some form of lockdown since the end of July, and it's just learnt that it will be in the strictest tier, Tier 3, meaning no household mixing and pubs and restaurants must stay shut. One senior Tory MP raising objections is the chairman of the 1922 Committee of Tory MPs, Sir Graham Brady, whose Altrincham and Sale West seat is in Greater Manchester. I should say we spoke to Graham before we knew which areas would fall under these new restrictions. Sir Graham Brady, welcome to Chopper's Politics. Now, why do you think that these harsher tiers are no better than a lockdown?
Well, I think it is a positive that we are coming out of the national lockdown. I think there are a number of other positives that were announced by the Prime Minister on Monday. It's a good thing that the government has now accepted, for instance, that the 10 p.m. curfew had no basis to it, and in fact, it was doing more harm than good. It's also very positive that the government recognised that it had been wrong to ban non-contact sports outdoors, like playing golf or tennis or bowls. So those are clear steps forward. But I think there are still some very serious concerns that remain. Now, I've spoken before about the very deep worry that I have that some of these restrictions are actually a very serious infringement of people's fundamental human rights, the freedom of movement, the freedom of family life, the right to conduct and form intimate relationships, the freedom to protest has been compromised, freedoms that we have taken for granted in this country for hundreds of years. So I have that very deep concern. Whilst I don't think that freedom can be seen as an absolute, I think we should start from the very strong presumption that people in a free democratic society should be able to do things unless there's a compelling reason why they can't. And that leads me on to the second point, which is the worry that these tiered restrictions, particularly at the top end in the third tier, are so serious in their effect that they could actually do more harm than good. We know now from experience that lockdowns and things like lockdowns have very serious effects, not just economic effects, the enormous loss of jobs the Chancellor's spoken about this week, the number of business failures, the loss of opportunities for young people in particular, but there are also health and mental health consequences, which I think we'll be living with for many, many years to come. So I think we should be very, very wary about putting areas into these very tight controls, especially areas that have had a period of many months in these harsh restrictions already.
It's quite a difficult decision, isn't it, for your colleagues in the party this weekend, because you'll be going home and effectively being asked to close your local pub next week.
Well, I don't. It's not just about closing the pub next week. I think the danger, in particular with the tier 3 restrictions, but it probably applies to a very large number of establishments under tier 2 as well. The danger is that a lot of pubs and restaurants simply aren't going to open again because they've been through this long period now, a cycle of lockdowns and restrictions, and some of them have been holding on, but only just. And having gone into a second national lockdown, if they come out of that only to be told that they're required just to serve takeaways, or there will be such serious constraints on the freedom of their customers to mingle with other households that they simply don't have the custom that they need to keep going, I think a lot of these small businesses are going to decide that it really isn't worth the candle and decide not to open at all.
I saw in the House of Commons this week on Tuesday, you asked, didn't you, again, for evidence of the economic analysis of these tiers and therefore the impact on mental health and other areas of Matt Hancock. And he said it's not possible to put a number on it, didn't he? Do you believe him?
Well, I asked for two things. One was the impact assessment, which ought to look at both sides of the account. It ought to look at what the government's hoping to achieve in terms of a reduction in infections and hospitalizations and a reduction in people losing their lives through COVID. But it also should look at the negative effects of lockdown or tier restrictions, which should go across the piece, looking at the impact on job losses, business failures, and the non-COVID health impact. People who will lose their lives because they've missed a cancer diagnosis or treatment for heart disease, and then the terribly sad legacy of mental health problems that I think will be generated by these restrictions. But I also then asked for some clarity about the criteria that will be used to decide whether an area goes into tier 1, 2, or 3. And the answer to that appears to be that the government's prepared to say that it's got a basket of different things by which it'll make the decision, but not to tell us what the weight given to each one of those factors will be. So we know they'll look at hospitalization rates, they'll look at infection rates, they'll look at infection rates amongst the over 65s. They will look at whether rates are going up or down and how quickly. That's all well and good. But what happens if the overall infection rate is flat, but the infection rate among 65s is falling very strongly, or the other way around? And at the moment, we're still in the dark.
And that will become very important, not that it isn't already, when the government reviews these plans after 2 weeks, just before Christmas, around the 17th, 18th of December, looking at my diary here. Matt Hancock did talk there about an element of judgment is important in making these decisions. And that's the problem, isn't it? That you can't see what's going into that equation. Do you think without this economic analysis being published next week, you and others will vote against these plans?
I'm very likely to oppose it on the basis of my concerns about civil liberties and the loss of people's fundamental rights. But I also will be looking very carefully at what is said about the economic impact and the other health impacts. I'll be looking very carefully at what is proposed in particular for my own area. But I think these concerns are much wider. The national effect, we've already seen this week from the Chancellor that the economy is expected to be over 11% smaller at the end of this year because of the response to COVID. Now, we all recognise these are not easy decisions, and the government's had a hellishly difficult set of choices to balance. But I am very concerned that the long-term effects of the response to COVID might cause greater harm than the short-term reduction in infections that they've been seeking to achieve.
How many Conservative MPs might join you voting against these tiers next week?
I don't know how many members on either side of the House might choose to oppose these things. I suspect it will depend very much on the levels of tier that are being applied to their own constituencies. And, of course, it's not just Conservative members of Parliament who are concerned about the increase in unemployment or the destruction of businesses in their constituencies. These concerns have been raised by some people on the Labour benches as well.
What's your alternative? I mean, if you were in government, you might say to you, well, it's all very well opposing tiers or opposing national lockdown, but what else can we do?
Well, I've said throughout, I was prepared to support the initial lockdown back in March. We knew very little about the virus or the likely effects, and there was a legitimate concern that the NHS might have been overwhelmed at that point. But since that, I've been making the case that we ought to be moving towards putting the responsibility in the hands of the public, treating the British people like grown-ups, able to make their own decisions and judgments and use their own common sense to protect their own health and that of others. And, I think we know the things which are beneficial in reducing infection rates. It's mostly about social distancing and hygiene. Hygiene, perhaps most importantly of all, hand hygiene is critically important. So the advice that we give to people can be very clear. The measures that have been introduced to make sure that pubs and restaurants and shops are trading safely, that they've been made into COVID-secure environments, we ought to have some confidence in those measures. There has been very little evidence of transmission in those venues since the measures were put in place to make them safer. So, I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of small businesses have been so upset by the second lockdown, because they had spent an enormous amount of money and put a huge amount of effort into responding to the government's requests to them or instructions to them to make their premises safe, only to be shut down again. So I think there are a great many things that can be done through sensible regulation and through trusting people to take good advice and use their judgment.
Do you think Boris Johnson would be on your side next week if he were on the backbenches?
Well, I certainly think that when Boris Johnson was writing his excellent columns in the Daily Telegraph, he would have been on the side of greater freedom. And I feel for him that the weight of the responsibility he has in reaching these judgments is enormous. But I just think the balance should be different.
Now, we talked a lot about liberty and freedoms on this podcast so far, Graham Brady. Can you tell me what happened on Tuesday when Charles Walker, the vice chairman of the 1922 committee, was in your office, and you both saw something out of your window, didn't you?
Essentially, I'd seen a very small group of people in Parliament Square, I think maybe about 15 or 20, and they were peacefully demonstrating next to the statue of Winston Churchill. I couldn't tell exactly what their protest was. But then I saw the police moving them on. Nearly all of the group moved on down towards Westminster Bridge. But a couple stayed, as far as I could tell, peacefully protesting and making their case. And I saw in particular an older lady being moved almost by force, but I'm not saying excessive force, moved up against the railings of the Palace of Westminster by a couple of police officers. So that's as far as I got when I had to go and chair my committee. I've seen the footage, though, subsequently of what prompted Sir Charles Walker to go and remonstrate with the police, which was that as this lady refused to move away and insisted on a right to peaceful protest, she was carried spread eagle by a number of police officers and put into the back of a police van. And I think Charles took the view this was rather excessive and was kind of policing that we really shouldn't be seeing.
Well, Graham Brady quite, and Charles Walker went straight from that situation to the House of Commons, where he had this to say.
This is a disgrace. This is un-British. It is unconstitutional. And this government, our Prime Minister, needs to end these injustices now. Madam Deputy Speaker, will you bring the Prime Minister and or the Home Secretary here today to sort this out? She was an old lady robbed of her dignity for having the courage to protest about having her fundamental rights and those of my constituents and others removed.
That's Charles Walker there in the House of Commons, Graham Brady. Do you think there's a risk this Conservative government might be seen as arrogant, heavy-handed? Do you remember how the last days of Tony Blair's government, there's an authoritarian tang to it, which was quite distasteful? And I wonder whether this government needs to be aware that's how it looks. I know it's a policing matter, I get all that, but it's just how it looks, and this feeling that the state is squashing individuality, is squashing right to protest with all the COVID laws. And there's a feeling, isn't there, it's not very conservative.
Well, I start from the premise that in this country, the people tell the government what it's allowed to do. It's not the government that tells the people what they are allowed to do. And I'm afraid that has become inverted in the last few months in the response to the COVID-19 crisis. And we can understand the difficulties of getting this right, but I think there is a danger of seeming heavy-handed. I think we saw back in the spring some of those unfortunate instances of heavy-handed policing. And, I think it's important to say, I think most of the policing was done in a perfectly sensible and proportionate way. But then when we had drones chasing people in the Peak District or in Greater Manchester, we saw a small child's birthday party in their front garden being dispersed by the police. Some of these things, at best, they're absurd. At worst, they're deeply worrying. And I think it's both incumbent on the police to make sure that they are behaving in a proportionate way and being appropriately cautious in their policing, and that they're maintaining that tradition of policing by consent. But ultimately, of course, and I'm sure that Charles would have seen this in the same way, whilst we might be concerned about the actions of some police officers, we have to take the responsibility as legislators if we have allowed emergency powers to be taken which are capable of being construed in that way and which lead some police officers to perhaps overstep the mark a little bit.
The right to protest, may it carry on. Just finally, Graham Brady, you're of course the author of the famous Brady Amendment. Let's not go there. That was 18 months ago, but you were famous for trying to find the middle way in these protracted Brexit negotiations. We are approaching the end game. Are you worried about it? Do you think we're going to get a no deal? Are you content with the red lines? Will the PM stick to them? Just in 1 minute.
Well, I'm very optimistic, and I've thought all along it's more likely than not that we will get a free trade agreement. It's in the interests of both sides.
Is that a no deal agreement, a free trade one, or is that
I think we will get a free trade agreement.
Which is what? No deal or deal?
Which is a deal. I think we will have a free trade agreement with the EU. It looks like it's going to be a free trade agreement dealing just with goods, not with services. And of course, because the EU has a big trade surplus with the UK in goods, it's even more in the interest of the EU side to see that agreement reached. So I suspect in the tradition of EU negotiations, it will go to the wire, but at the very last moment, I think we are very likely to have that agreement.
And there'll be no sellout on fish or on level playing fields at the so-called state aid issue. You think fisheries will be settled? It
is obviously right that having chosen to leave the European Union, the United Kingdom should properly regain its sovereignty, which means that those long-term rights that belong to the British people ought to be protected. And a free trade agreement with the European Union shouldn't be allowed to subsume those rights of sovereignty. But most of these things, such as the agreements for who can fish, under what circumstances, are really practical matters which can be settled with a bit of pragmatism and compromise.
Well, on that optimistic note, Graham Brady, chairman of the 1922 Committee of Tory MPs, thank you so much for joining me this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, stay with us. Next up, we're talking about debt, deals and deficits, right after this.
It begins as a love story. Couples who meet as young activists, bonded in a fight against injustice.
We seem to have similar outlooks in life. He often made me feel very special.
It felt like we were in love. I remember it being quite magical.
As far as I was concerned, we had a future together.
I fully did envisage my future with him.
But then, he starts acting strangely.
Suddenly there were secrets and there were inconsistencies and there were things that didn't make sense.
Then one day, he leaves.
I came home from work and I realised immediately that he'd gone.
Vanishes without a trace. And the reason why these men disappear is so disturbing, it's led to a formal apology from the state.
I never for a moment thought that it would be what it actually turned out to be.
This is Bed of Lies, the true story of one of the biggest scandals in recent British history, and the latest podcast from the Telegraph.
talk about the Stasi in East Germany. That's not how we understand our society.
A tale that travels from the safety of a loving bedroom to the very heart of the law. Search for Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
And we're back. Highest borrowing in peacetime, the biggest economic drop in 300 years, and potentially 2.6 million of us unemployed by the middle of next year. Just some of the top lines coming out of the Chancellor's spending review this week. And you won't have missed those numbers, they're splashed all over the front pages. Here at the Telegraph, we went with Sunak. Our economic recovery has only just begun. That rather dampens the festive spirit, doesn't it? So I thought I'd give former Trade Secretary Liam Fox a call to get into some number crunching. I started by asking him what he'd have done this week if he'd been in the Chancellor's shoes.
Probably in reality much the same, because there's a limit to what can actually be done in the current circumstances. And I think what he's basically saying is wait and see. We don't know what the recovery will look like. We don't know what the global situation will look like. We have to just set a one-year spending program and then come back and see what the options are later on. Basically, we don't really know whether the recovery will be a slow one, whether we might see no recovery at all if we get into a global slump, or whether we might see, as someone put it yesterday, a return to the roaring 20s in the way that we did after the pandemic of 1918. So I think that we have to be patient. I think all the calls for we must balance the books quickly, we must see either tax rises or spending cuts are utterly premature. And this is a time for a genuinely small C Conservative Chancellor to make sensible and rational choices, which I think he's done.
You mentioned tax rises. Will that be happening in the spring budget, do you think, or will you wait a year?
Well, I think we've got to wait at that point. I don't think it will be clear until after the spring what the return to normal will be like. We know that we'll get a vaccine. That vaccine will have a number of economic impacts. For example, it means we will not having to be paying for the furlough. It means that the test and trace system will not be required to the same degree. So we could see, if the vaccine scheme is successful and rolled out quickly, a relatively quick return to norm. I think there are questions around the UK economy and the type of recovery we can get. I've never really believed in this idea of getting a V-shaped recovery, partly because we're such a service-orientated economy. Services require people, and COVID is an anti-people economic element, if you like. It will require a recovery in our social norms to see a return in the hospitality sector, in tourism, which are, of course, very highly people-orientated.
Of course, there were 3 different forecasts put out by the OBR this week alongside the spending review. The central one is that we won't get back to normal until this time next year. Are you one of those, or do you believe in the upside like the PM does?
I think it's impossible to say. I mean, I wouldn't be putting my house on the anything that the OBR says its forecasting hasn't been great, but I think you're likely to get better accuracy from the weather forecast than you are from economic forecasts. And I think that we don't yet understand what the international implications are going to be. We're an economy that depends for 2/3 of our GDP on trade, imports and exports. So we are, of course, going to be dependent on what the global recovery is like. And this is a point that I think is not really discussed enough. In this era of globalization, a UK recovery on its own is just not going to happen. We require there to be concerted international efforts to get a global recovery underway. And one of my worries has been what the impact will be on the developing world of continued depressed demand in the world's wealthiest economies, because it will have a number of effects. Number one, with rising unemployment that we're going to see in the big Western economies, that will make it more difficult for migrant labour. That means smaller remittances going back to developing countries. It also means that commodity prices may be depressed as a result of less demand, and that will also have an impact on their economy. So we will require a global response through the IMF, through the World Bank and so on to this crisis to ensure that we're not hit by depressed demand having a secondary economic depression.
In that global picture, do you think the Chancellor was wrong to cut aid?
Well, I think that aid is only a part of it, and I think that we need to be looking at the debate in the whole. I think that there's no sacrosanct figure. 0.7 is a figure chosen for political purposes. We have one of the most generous and one of the most effective aid programs in the world. And I think that you need to look at that alongside the other side of the equation, which is the trade side. And we have been in the G20, which accounts for 90% of global GDP and 80% of global trade. We've been increasing the barriers to access for the developing world over the past 10 years. And let me give you a concrete example of that. Back at the end of the financial crisis, only 0.7% of all the imports of the G20 countries were covered by restrictive measures of one sort or another. That's now 10.3%. In other words, while we've been giving aid on one hand, we've been actually making it more difficult on the other for these countries to access our markets. And actually, I believe it's more important for these countries to be able to trade their way out of poverty than it is to be getting handouts from the world's richest countries.
You called earlier this week for an entrepreneur test to be applied to all government policy. Is that what you saw this week in the spending review?
Well, I think that's something that needs to come in our wider policy. I mean, the spending review it was not a budget. I mean, it doesn't talk about how we will help shape through our taxation system and others the behaviour of our businesses. But what I said was that we have to remember where our money comes from. We've got to get out of this potential habit of saying that we're going to spend the money before we know how we're going to raise the money. And, it is boring, I know, but it's nonetheless the truth that there is no such thing as government money. There is only taxpayers' money. And we have to ensure that any recovery we get is a private sector-led recovery. People will always be calling for more money for public services, and, you can always make a case for it. But in the private sector, there have been enormous sacrifices made. Wages have fallen faster. There is less job security. People in the public sector have that job security. They also have those pension arrangements that don't apply to many of those small businesses. And I want the Conservative Party to be the party of every small business, every white van man and every white van woman in Britain. The wealth of our country, the employment of our country is built upon those small businesses. And every corner shop owner, every little business that does without a family holiday, these are the people that we need to support. The Conservative Party must be the party of small business, because small business is the route to the country's prosperity.
You're well plugged into the government, Liam Fox. Brexit, let's say the B word again, the first time in a while. Will it happen early next week? What are your red lines? Do you worry about EU creativity to get a deal? That might mean Brino, Brexit in name only.
We'll not get Brexit in name only. We have left the European Union, and it's very clear that David Frost, with the authority of the Prime Minister, is making sure that our sovereignty is the key issue there. I've always believed that we would get an agreement, because I think it's so strongly in the interests of both parties to get one at a time when we're seeing big issues around security in Europe.
But how late can they go? How late can they wait for it? We know the arguments why there needs to be a deal, but how late can they wait for one?
Well, the history of trade agreements is that they always go to the wire. I don't see why anyone is surprised that this one is doing so.
And the wire is next week, or is the wire New Year's Eve? Where is that line?
It will be at the latest point where we can legislate for any necessary change. And that's, we're getting quite close to that, I think. But, where there's a will, there's a way. And politicians can make things happen if they want to make them happen.
Is there a fear, do you think, that some of your colleagues on the European Research Group might vote against the deal? The deal may have to go through on Labour support. That would be a disaster for the PM, wouldn't it, were that to happen?
We've got a majority of 80 in the House of Commons. Any agreement will go through on the support of the Conservative Party. I think the Labour Party are likely to support in any case.
Yes.
As far as Keir Starmer is concerned, he will want the issue out of the way. It's been a running sore in the Labour Party. But I think it's not just now about the two respective parties, the UK and the EU. To go back to the point we were making earlier, the global economy is now in such a difficult position. It's looking for sources of confidence to move forward. And I think an EU-UK trade agreement would provide one of those rare rays of sunshine at the present time, which would actually be positive in terms of international investors, and inward direct investment is very key to recovery.
Liam Fox, thank you so much for joining me this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, you heard Liam Fox there talking about why entrepreneurs should be the key to recovery. And someone who knows a thing or two about business is my next guest. John Caldwell is the founder of Phones for You, the mobile phone chain, and a prominent Conservative donor, giving a whopping £500,000 to the party on the eve of the election last year. But given how this year played out, does he think his money was well spent?
What a good question. Well, Yes, it was, because the thought of having a Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell government was terrifying. And I firmly believed that that government would do irreparable damage to the UK from all aspects of the UK, and especially for the working class people. So from that point of view, yes, I assume the point of your meaning on this is that have the Conservatives showered themselves with glory on the way they've handled the pandemic?
Yes.
Right, well, that's a different question, because I think, first of all, Boris did a great job on Brexit. All right, we're not across the line yet, but he was strong, bold, and it's what was needed if we were ever to get a chance of a decent deal with the Europeans. So I very much supported Boris on his stance there. Unfortunately, the handling of the pandemic, I think, has been a little bit muddled from time to time. I don't necessarily think any party would have done it any better. I think they were faced with huge challenges, and I don't think any Prime Minister has ever been faced with greater challenges than Boris Johnson has. It's a horrendous first year that he found himself in. Regarding the economy, I am disappointed, because I have been forecasting numbers right from day one. I forecast that the UK economy would be devastated in the middle of March. Nobody really agreed with me or took notice. I forecast 3 million unemployed shortly after then. And around that time, I also forecast that GDP would fall by 15%. As a result of all this thinking, I came up with Caldwell Pandemic Recovery, which I call CPR for short, but it's also very appropriate because it is all about the rescuing and the life-saving treatment of something that's dying. And within Caldwell Pandemic Recovery, I call upon the government to borrow an extra, on top of everything that's gone before, an extra 500 billion to £1 trillion to invest in 4 cornerstone aspects that will make Britain great again. One is apprenticeship schemes to get between 500,000 and 1 million young people off the dole and back into really useful and productive jobs that will give them skills for life. The second is to invest in a green energy city, where the green energy city not only runs on green energy and is green through and through in its whole attitude, but also every person that lives there and works there is working in the green energy industry, and make that to Britain, to the green energy space, what the Silicon Valley is to technology. And that would really create hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs in the years to come and create productivity. And then the other method was to invest in infrastructure in general to make Britain more effective in its communication.
We heard the CPR, the Caldwell Pandemic Recovery Plan, set out in the summer. The Telegraph ran opinion pieces by you at the time. Isn't it broadly what Rishi Sunak has found time to do? He is borrowing heavily. They are talking about investing heavily in the north. They are talking about investing heavily. They can't do everything you want, but perhaps you can afford to do it yourself. You're the country's 97th richest man, I read. But don't you think that they're doing their best within the confines of their competing demands in government?
Absolutely not. What they're doing is a tiny part of what needs to be done. Look, we're in a situation where money has never, ever been so cheap. We're in a situation where the UK has never, ever been under so much threat. Any businessman that's listening to this will understand that if they've got the opportunity to invest in something that's going to create them turnover, profit, and jobs, any businessman will do that when the cost of borrowing is very low. That's the opportunity that presents itself.
Isn't that a big risk, though? How do you know? How do you know they'll stay low for so long? That's what the others tell us here. You see, in the world of politics.
No, there is no chance of interest rates rising in the foreseeable future, none whatsoever. But in any event, if we don't do this, the cost of failure will cost us just as much. If you calculate the cost of having 3 million people unemployed, and add on to that all the loss of revenue from corporation tax, from income tax, and from VAT, and all those revenues that the government are going to lose, And add all that together, it's probably going to be £100 billion a year extra that they'll have to borrow just to cover those deficits. So why not actually take the bull by the horns and do something productive that is going to save the economy in the next 5 to 10 years? But in 5 to 10 years, I guarantee if we do not do this, we'll be looking back and saying, why didn't we?
Well, yes, maybe, and well, maybe not. There'll be lots of why didn't we chats about the entire approach to the pandemic. You've been a supporter of the idea of herd immunity, haven't you? Do you still abide by that?
Yes, but things have changed. I was a fan of a herd immunity and still am. But if that herd immunity can be gained by a vaccine, of course, that's the obvious thing to do. But when I was advocating herd immunity quite strongly, the vaccine looked like a long, long, long way off.
Yes.
And when you look at the damage done by lockdown and by not going down the herd immunity route, my contention is that the damage done to society through depressions, suicides, lack of attention for other illnesses, and low morale, and you add all of that damage together, I believe that is a far higher price to pay than the deaths that we have had and would have had with more of a liberalisation to gain herd immunity.
What's your take on these new tiers that have been announced on Thursday in the Commons? How will they affect your various companies now? Are you in retail still?
No, I'm not, fortunately, and my heart bleeds for all those businesses out there because there's so many businesses now that are completely and utterly devastated. In some cases, people's life's work disappearing, all their employees under threat, and it's so, so tragic.
In the spending review this week, Rishi Sunak set aside £4 billion to help the jobless get back to work. Is that money well spent? You know a lot about that from your charity work and your companies.
Well, it is money well spent, depending on how they spend it. But, you know, this is where you challenged me before. You said they can't do everything. Well, no, they can't do everything, but they can do what's essential. And what's essential is CPR. That is essential.
Yeah, CPR is almost a wish list, isn't it? If money grew on trees, or am I being too unfair?
No, it's not a wish list because we can afford it. I don't know, and nor does Rishi Sunak, how much the government can borrow, how much the money the Bank of England will print. We don't know that, but we can have the objective to use money, as much money as we can possibly get hold of, to invest in the future in the creation of jobs.
Even though it might leave us like Zimbabwe or something, we might be left with sky-high inflation if we're just printing money like that.
No, that will not happen. The risk to the economy is very simply very low interest rates and very low inflation and possibly deflation.
For how long? How long, John Caldwell? How long will that last for?
A long, long time, because there's nothing there to inflate the economy. You know, what we have is deflationary trends everywhere. Don't make no mistake, we are in the biggest depression we've ever been in. And just the fact that we bounced back and we've had a month of positive growth, a quarter of positive growth that puts us in and not a technical recession, we are in an absolute depression. We've got huge, huge challenges ahead that need to be addressed.
Given you're so interested in the world of politics, which would be welcomed, I think, for any big businessman to do so, do you want to be in politics yourself? Do you fancy a run for office?
No, I'm afraid absolutely not, no.
You're young enough, you're 68, about to be a dad again, come on.
No, definitely not politics, no. I am only taking this stance and doing a lot of work on these issues at the moment because I feel so passionately about the great remaining in Britain and us remaining Great Britain, and I will fight like fury to influence the government and influence everybody to do what I absolutely know what's right. And I would challenge the government to have a group of businessmen, any top businessman that they choose, to be in a room with me and for them to argue against my point, because I think they would end up agreeing to my points. And then Boris and Rishi would probably see what they really need to do.
Well, to be a fly on the wall in that conversation, John Caldwell, would you donate finally to the Tories again, or have you put enough money into politics so far?
Well, I only donated there under extreme circumstances. I won't say not or never, but it would depend on the situation and how passionately I felt that my donation was going to help Britain remain Great Britain.
On that note, John Caldwell, the founder of Phones for You and a huge philanthropist in this country, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure.
Now, if any of this podcast has triggered some thoughts you've got, please do email us. We're on chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk or tweet us @chopperspodcast. And as ever, if you want to support the quality journalism that makes this podcast happen, please do take out a Telegraph subscription. Go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper and you'll pay nothing for 30 days and then just £2 a week. What a bargain. Thanks as ever to my guests, Sir Graham Brady, Liam Fox and of course John Caldwell. Thank you to my brilliant producers, Louisa Wells, Theo Ludis and Elliot Lampitt. And of course, thank you to you for listening. I really do appreciate it. Finally, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph in all good newsagents. Until next time, cheerio!